Hey everyone, welcome in. We'll be getting started shortly. All right, so we've hit 7 p.m., so I guess it's time to get rolling. Welcome in everyone. Hard to believe that Labor Day is just around the corner, but here we are. So thanks for joining for our annual Back to School webinar for juniors. My name is Jim Wismer. I can see from the participant list that many of you have already spoken with me about something or another. I oversee all of our SAT and ACT test prep and academic subject tutoring at Ivy Experience. I'm joined today by Kate McLaughlin, and she's our director of college admissions, working closely with families on their college essays and applications. So without further ado, let's jump on into it. Okay, so I'd like to start by just talking about kind of what is and what isn't in a student's control in the entire kind of college admissions process. And we're going to use the C word, so to speak, a lot tonight, because the goal of tonight is really to get you to understand sort of how colleges will be evaluating students. So college admissions involves a lot of different factors, and these 5 are just some of them. However, these are the 5 that we truly believe at Ivy Experience that students can actually impact. So other things will go into your, college acceptances, things like demographic information, what school you go to, and a variety of other factors. However, these are the 5 things students can really take the reins on and control throughout their education. And so these are going to be the focus of what we speak about today throughout our presentation. I'm going to start with what is considered to be the most significant factor, and that would be grades and academic rigor. So when I talk about grades, I mean, the actual grades that you're scoring in your high school transcript. Rigor means sort of the difficulty level of your courses. So things like honors, AP, IB, dual enrollment courses. So grades are by far the most important factor. There is no substitute for grades in college admissions. Junior year is generally considered to be the most important year of grades from a college admissions standpoint. And the main reason for that is that it's your last full year of grades that colleges are going to see, before you're off to school. One thing that's really important to remember for our current juniors and their families that are in here, if you had a virtual or hybrid year of high school, depending on where in the country you are and where you went to school, colleges will be paying more attention to your in-person grades than your virtual grades. Virtual grades, as I'll talk about shortly, are kind of inconsistent school to school, and colleges aren't really necessarily sure what to do with them. In-person grades are the same things they've been evaluating for years. So it's important to remember that when school's in person, those grades are going to be more impactful. And just remember that even though junior year is the most important, the start of senior year will matter from a grade perspective as well. So one thing to note about grades now, parents, is that grades do not mean the same thing that they meant when you were in school. And what do I mean by that? Since 2010, according to this ACT study, there's been a pretty marked increase in the average high school student's GPA. And you can see that this trend tracks a corresponding decrease in scores on ACT, which is one of the standardized tests students can take for college, very much like the SAT. So what we see is that there was sort of a general trend of upward grade inflation through 2018, and then it really took off in 2020 with the pandemic. There were a lot of schools that had a policy in 2020 that your grade could go up, but it couldn't go down once everything went virtual in March. But even since then, grade inflation has kind of held up. So it's important to remember that grades in the current high school climate don't necessarily mean the same thing they did before. For students that are trying to get into that very most selective tier of schools, you really can't have a B. I mean, it's possible to get in with a B, but if your goal is like a Harvard or an MIT, very extremely selective school, then for you, you really can't let a B get through on your transcript. Now, again, it's possible you're just putting yourself at a big disadvantage because there'll be so many students in the country that apply with straight A's. Now, this isn't to say every student needs to totally beat themselves up over every B. There's a college out there for everyone. But if you are aiming at that very most selective tier, which is not something every student should do, trust me, then that is something I want to say up front. You need to make sure that your grades are on point from start to finish. So the important thing to keep in mind from a grades and rigor standpoint, if high school hasn't been off to the strongest start for you, is that growth matters. And what that means is, if your student had a rocky transition to high school or had some, mental health troubles in freshman and sophomore year, if they're able to build on that and improve their grades over time, colleges know that the junior year version of your student is more similar to the college version than the sophomore or freshman year version of your student is. So you can do a lot of good for yourself by showing that upward trajectory. Colleges aren't just looking at a GPA. Now, like I said, it's still obviously best if the grades are strong, start to finish. Duh. But at the same time, you can do a lot of good by peaking at the right time and improving your performance in school. One thing I like to note for families is, and this is especially true if you have a student who's targeting kind of competitive engineering programs, if you're planning to apply to competitive engineering programs, you need to be in calculus by senior year and ideally during junior year. So for some students, if they've kind of come into engineering late in their high school career, that might mean doing some work over the summer to catch up or get ahead in math. That's something you want to be thinking about now. So what should you do now? One thing I really emphasize to students, I know the school year is just starting, but keep finals and AP exams, if you're taking APs, on your mind now. The more work you do throughout the school year to stay on top of your grades, the easier it's going to be to prepare for those cumulative tests at the end of the year. Every spring, we get a ton of requests from students asking for tutoring for this or that subject, AP exam or final. And, we're always happy to do it, and we'll work with students to, catch up and make up lost ground. But it is so much easier to get ready for these tests if you've been doing well throughout the school year. So just remember that when you have those cumulative tests coming up, if you're letting things slide throughout the year, it's only going to get worse later. If you find that a student is falling behind in class, the first thing you should do is reach out to your teacher for extra help. Most teachers are happy to, meet before or after school, during study halls, whenever possible, to get students caught up, or they might be able to point you to some kind of resource that can help. Failing that, you can always, form a study group. This is common, like a homework group for a math class where, you might be stumped by a problem, but maybe a friend can help you through it. Keep in mind with a study group that, you want to make sure everyone's contributing and learning a lot from it. You can't just kind of show up and let the quote unquote smart kids do all the work and just kind of copy the answers down. That's not doing you any good. It's making sure that your homework gets turned in, but that's about it. The final thing I'll say here is that, when kind of this preparation throughout the school year doesn't work out, that's the time that you consider, reaching out for a tutor. So be proactive if you know that you're falling behind and these other support systems that you could be working with aren't going to work for you. And the reason I say that is every year around October, we get a huge push of people requesting tutoring, often in math and science courses that really challenge students. And the reason for that is that the first big exams of the year, grades come back around that time. So students don't do well on that exam. And then they've got this kind of albatross around their neck throughout the entire school year where they're trying to make up a grade that didn't go well early in the year. So the more proactive about this you can be, if you can realize that you're falling behind earlier on in a class, then you're going to prevent those issues and possibly even need less tutoring throughout the year, because maintaining a level is a lot less time than catching up. So when we work with students on academics, it's not just about making sure they know the content. We try to teach students how to fish. We're not just handing them fish. It's not about just getting a grade on that next big exam. It's about building the study skills and habits that are going to lead to long-term success. So a lot of that will come down to test taking strategies and best practices for exams. So we'll help your student understand, from whatever information they can get from their teacher, how are they being tested? So often in an AP course, part of the exams or even the whole exam could be past year's AP exams, or it could be in the format of those AP exams, and making sure that students are comfortable with those test taking strategies and the test format, in addition to mastering the content knowledge that they need, is going to be the best way to consistently perform well on those all along. Either way, again, start sooner rather than later if tutoring is something you need. Not every student's going to need tutoring in every subject, and I totally get that. And, I'm rooting for your students to do their best independently. It's awesome when we see students, rise up to a challenge and do it on their own. But when tutoring is called for, reach out sooner rather than later. All right, with that, I'll hand it over to Kate to talk about letters of recommendation.
Thanks, Jim. Hey, y'all, I'm Kate McLaughlin. As Jim said, I'm the director of college admissions. So letters of recommendation. So here's the thing that I think the reason oftentimes when we say it's one of the 5 things under your control, families are surprised to hear that. They're thinking, wait a minute. It's a letter of recommendation from someone else. How is that under my control? So one of the things that you can actually do is influence your recommendation by building meaningful relationships with those teachers that you're likely to ask, right? So admissions officers are looking for people who have insight into you. Guess what? The best way to get recommendations that have insight into you is to know your teachers, right? And there's a difference. There's a balance between raising your hand to ask a question just to make your voice heard and raising your hand to actually have a question and engage with the teacher, going to office hours for reasons, right? I'm not a fan of hovering around a teacher for no reason, just so they know your name. What I'm talking about is deeply engage. Find the teachers who know what you're into and who are into what you're into, and go for it. Ask for extra help, right? Junior year, they're really going to be looking for a junior year teacher in a main subject as one of your recommenders. So especially right now, you're starting out, now is the great time to start asking questions and building conversations and looking for depth with your teachers. Who do you genuinely connect with? You're always going to have 1 to 2 teachers. When we say core subject, we really do mean core subject, right? So your math class, your English class, your history class, your science class, one of those 4 cores. Occasionally, we make an argument for if it makes sense for the second one to be a language, if you're very involved with it and you've had that teacher multiple years. But for the most case, you're really looking at 2 teachers who are in your core class area. I think that one way I like to tell students, and I think it's nice to know ahead of time, because this is how I tell students to ask, because to be honest with you, my background is in teaching, and teachers don't love writing recommendations, even if they love you. And I'm sure they love you. Writing recommendations is a nightmare. It's a pain. You want to do justice to the kid, but you've got a bunch to write. You had them the whole year. What do you remember? How do you show up? How do you show up for that student in the best way and still balance what your life is, right? So I always tell students, 1, start by building a genuine relationship with that teacher early on. And 2, when it comes to time for asking, which by the way, you're going to want to ask before you go away for summer, it should be like on your list, like bing, hey, summer's coming. I got to ask those teachers I spent all this whole year building a relationship with. We often suggest writing a lovely little note to your teacher where you can say, hey, ask them in person, hey, Mr. Wismer, will you write my recommendation letter? And if they say yes, send them a little thank you note. Dear Mr. Wismer, thank you so much for agreeing to write my recommendation letter. Before I go, I just want to say I really appreciated X, Y, and Z about your class. Now, the point is not to be brown nosy and creepy and just say thank you and ingratiate yourself. The point is to bring up some cool stuff you did, right? What did you learn? What was challenging that you overcame? What was the project you got the most out of? Because what you're doing is priming them to remember key memories and moments about you that they can then use to write more detailed and more kind of you recommendations, which is what we're looking for. So when we say they're under your control, that's what we mean. And we, if you work with us on essays, we actually have a whole kind of document guide that can help you write that little letter. But if nothing else, if you don't work with us, ask your teachers before you go into the summer, and then write them a thank you note and remind them why you're so awesome, and they'll love you, and you're going to get a much better rec anyway. I will say there are times where you do want an extra recommendation beyond those 2 core teachers and your counselor. In general, schools don't want to read more than what they've asked for, right? You really don't want to add in a 3rd recommendation letter, but there are instances where you really might want, and I think actually, Jim, don't you have a good example of this from your life?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
one of my recommenders for college personally was my ninth grade history teacher. Now, typically you don't want to ask a freshman year teacher just because it's been a long time since, you were in that class, and then hopefully you've grown and changed a lot over the years in high school. That is the point. However, my freshman history teacher was also my high school track and field coach. And so I spent hours after school with this man, every day for the winter and spring seasons. I also was sort of a late bloomer physically. So the spring of my senior year, I was one of the highest scoring athletes on our track team and a captain. However, that doesn't help for college admissions, right? Because everything's due in December. So at the latest. And so essentially, I was in a position where I had put so much time and effort into track and field. And I was, one of those people who was kind of like a leader in my class throughout the time I was on that team. I was trusted with a lot of responsibility when we would, run an invitational meet and things like that. But that was never going to come across just in an activity list where it just said, JV, 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 freshman, sophomore, junior. So this person who knew me in the classroom, but also knew me really, really well outside of the classroom, made for a great recommender for that reason. So it's not to say you always need to pick a junior year core subject teacher. You just need to have a very good reason if you're going to deviate from that.
Right. And especially teachers you've had multiple years, that's another win. And lastly, and maybe I should have said this up front, but bonus points if those are teachers who are knew you in classes that you're applying for, right? So if you're thinking, oh, I want to be an engineer, it'd be a pretty good idea if one of your recommenders was one of your math teachers, right? So where possible, looking for alignment, admissions officers are sort of looking for the puzzle pieces to fit together. So it sort of stands to reason that you might have a recommendation in a class that you love from a teacher that you have that relationship with.
Right. And of course, very linked with your future area of study would be another reason to reach away from junior year. So say you love chemistry, you want to study chemistry, you took chemistry as a sophomore and had a great relationship with the teacher, that's totally acceptable. So again, there are exceptions here, but the kind of basic format is to ask those junior year core subject teachers.
For sure. And we sort of touched on this, the how should we ask, right? In person is the classiest way to do it. You can add a cup of coffee with that if you really want to. No one's going to be mad about it, but really in person is the way to ask, right? Ask in person, make sure you say like, listen, I was thinking this could be great. I took chemistry. I want to study chemistry. I loved your class last year or this year. Would you be game, right? And then provide a brag sheet. We'll talk about more about what that is, but it's essentially, I'm arguing for putting that in a little bit of a nice note, but a brag sheet is essentially the stuff that your teachers need to know that is amazing about you, right? So think of it as an informal resume. And families, parents especially, make sure you get eyes on that student brag sheet. The reason they're called brag sheets is because we want you to brag. And students, if you're like me, it's hard to brag about yourself, right? Parents have a much easier time. So loop your parents in on that brag sheet. So starting out with, hey, would you be so kind as to write me a recommendation? Here's why you'd be a great fit for me. If they say yes, hey, here's my brag sheet. Thank you so much. And then sending a little follow-up email with the specifics of what you did in the class that was meaningful. And that is more likely to get you a killer, true to you recommendation.
Awesome. All right. Now we get to talk about my favorite subject, most people's least favorite subject, standardized testing. So I mentioned I'm kind of our chief test nerd here at Ivy Experience. So I like to start this whole conversation from kind of a more global perspective, thinking, why do colleges use standardized tests in the first place? And I think this conversation is especially important in our current atmosphere where almost every school is test optional, meaning you don't have to include standardized testing as part of how you prepare for college. The question then becomes, why would you want to? So what do standardized tests do for colleges? Why did they ever require them? Why do they still prefer to see them in a lot of cases, really most cases? The answer is that standardized tests help colleges predict students' success on campus. And so one of the most predictive variables by all of the studies that these universities do internally, the few studies that have been published externally, in a college applicant's profile to determine what their GPA will be their freshman year and the rate at which they graduate from college, right? As in they're actually sticking with it for the 4 years and getting out and being successful, is the standardized test score. And that's why a college would want to see it as part of your application. The other thing that a standardized test score lets a college do is compare a student with their local context. So one of the things that goes out with your college application that a lot of students and parents don't know about is something called a school report. And this is sent with your high school transcript. The school report is prepared by your high school's guidance office, and it includes a bunch of information about that school. So essentially, it'll include information like, what AP courses are offered at the school, or are any AP courses offered at the school? How does your school's GPA scale work? So if they see 4.0 or 5.0 or out of 100 or letter grade GPA, right? They need to know how to kind of how that sausage is made so that they compare one student to another. And also on that sheet will be the average SAT and ACT scores for that high school. And so colleges are able to compare students with the school that they went to so they can get a sense of what students' kind of profiles are like. And so that's really valuable if you think, say you're from the Philadelphia area like I am, and a lot of our families are. If you're applying to some small liberal arts school in California, well, they might not know Great Valley High School is where I went to school. So this small liberal arts school in California gets, maybe an applicant from Great Valley every 3 years or something like that. They don't know anything about the school, so they need to consult the school report in that situation. On the other hand, an applicant from Great Valley High School in the Philly suburbs that applies to Temple, well, Temple gets over 10 applicants a year from Great Valley High School. They have admissions officers that are assigned regionally. They know Great Valley High School really well, and that means that school report won't be as necessary for them. But it still allows schools or colleges, that is, to see kind of what a student's high school is like in a lot of ways, and that gives them important context. And then finally, the last thing about test scores is that it's important to remember that it's kind of one factor among many. So one way to kind of think about it is that in your college application, you can think of your grades and your test scores as the front page. And essentially, admissions officers are going to look at that and decide how seriously to take it when they open up and look at the rest. So you have your subjective factors, your things like extracurricular activities, your things like essays, applications themselves. All of that is really important. But the test scores and the grades piece of it matter a lot as well. So students have a choice to make between the SAT and ACT. And so I know that a lot of the families I've already been talking to have heard this spiel from me on the phone or heard it in other of our webinars. But essentially, because students have the choice between the two tests, you want to try both and see how they go. Now, in general, big picture, the tests are very, very similar. They both have a reading section that works the same way. You read passages and answer questions about them. Math is math. SAT breaks it up into a no calculator section and a calculator section. ACT, you can use a calculator the whole time, but it covers almost the exact same content. There are some subtle differences in the frequency with which certain things are tested, and then some topics show up on one but not the other. Writing and language is the grammar section of the SAT. English is the grammar section of the ACT. They're very similar editing tests. They underline part of a sentence and ask you to fix it. And then finally, ACT has this section called science that does not appear on the SAT. And people think of this as one of the biggest differences between the two tests. I'm here to tell you, it's not that much of a difference. And that's because ACT science actually just tests students' ability to read graphs and charts. You don't have to know the parts of a cell or how to balance a chemical equation or anything like that. You just need to be able to interpret the information in front of you, and that information is in the context of science experiments. That same exact skill is tested in every single section of the SAT. So you're not really avoiding science by taking the SAT. And in fact, SAT reading is more heavy on science content, as is the writing and language section, as are the two SAT math sections. So the SAT, to balance out not having a separate science section, they include more science-based content in the other sections. So the big difference between the two tests is one of timing. You might notice if you look at the number of questions and minutes for each test. So math is kind of the easiest one to see because in ACT, you get exactly 1 minute per question, 60 and 60. But on the SAT, you get more minutes than questions, right, throughout both math sections. And that holds true, more time per question in every section of the SAT. The trade-off is that the ACT's questions and passages are a little more straightforward. So if you were to just look at one question from each test, on average, you'd think the ACT question was easier. But if you look at taking the whole section at once, it's a grind to get through that much material on the ACT. You have more of a relaxed pace on the SAT, but the questions themselves are more challenging. So what I have here, just to underscore that point about science, by the way, one of these two questions and the table that comes with it is from SAT reading. The other's from ACT science. And without being like a total standardized test psychopath like me, where you can memorize the font and formatting from both of these tests because you spend all day looking at them, you would have no idea which is which. But they're essentially the same question. They're looking at a table and find this information, right? So both of these tests test mostly the same stuff. That's kind of the basic point. And trying both tests is the best way to figure out which one's going to be better for you in the long run. So the answer to the question of which one is better to take, it is to try both and compare the scores. Based on how you do, we can compare the scores and say which of the two is stronger or weaker. A lot of students will score relatively similarly on the two tests. And if that's the case, then we're looking at things with more of a fine-tooth comb and saying, okay, we noticed that you're stronger in this area on this test, weaker in that area on that test. And we're going to try to figure out like kind of what is your cleanest and easiest path to improving. If you're, struggling in an area on the ACT where we tend to see students improve really quickly, that might be a good sign for a lot of improvement. So that's just kind of one example. But the idea is we offer a free diagnostic test to anyone who works with us or not. You're not obligated to work with us if you do this. You complete it at home. I send you an email with instructions. You send back the answer sheets to us via email. We grade it, compare the scores, and give our recommendation. At that point, I'll offer to kind of consult with you on a plan and a timeline for your testing. You can take me up on that or not. If you never want to speak to us again, that's okay. Although I wouldn't recommend it. We do a really good job with test prep, in my humble opinion, as the person who trains all the tutors. But I will say that taking this diagnostic test is an important step for every student. Before you invest any time or money into the process of preparing for one of these tests, make sure it's the right test. And we will be sending out, by the way, our diagnostic as a recap email for everyone that registered for this. So you can expect that email tomorrow. In terms of when to take the test, we typically recommend as kind of a plan A timeline for students to take the test early in the fall of junior year. So I have September and October bolded here. Now, it's a little late if you haven't done anything and you're thinking to prepare now. If you're going to start test prep around like from now through the end of September, then you'd want to aim for the December test dates. So in general, the kind of timeline for when you want to take the test is dictated by your math level. So the two key classes are Algebra 2 and Geometry. If your school does an integrated math curriculum, which I know a lot of them do now, then email me what school and what level of integrated math, and I can read the tea leaves for you and tell you what is equivalent to Algebra 2 and Geometry. But essentially, the Algebra 2 and Geometry are the last big pieces of the math on both tests, and you want to make sure you have those before you take the test. If you're taking Algebra 2 or Geometry or the equivalent in an integrated math curriculum as a junior, then in that case, you would want to take your test for the first time in the spring of junior year. If you finished with that math class as a sophomore or earlier, then you would want to take it for the first time in the fall of junior year. The advantage of taking it in the fall is that you could retake early in the spring if you need it. And basically you get 2 stabs at the test before that end of junior year rush. And I could tell you from experience working in test prep for all these years, no students get their test prep homework done in May and June. It overlaps with AP exams. It overlaps with final exams at school, final papers, final projects. That end of junior year is going to be the most academically busy time of your life to date, students. It's just a fact. And so anything you can do to kind of front load your test prep away from that is going to help you a lot. So we recommend testing, if possible, if you have all the math for the first time by winter break, essentially. And then you would have a retake early in the spring. If you are taking Algebra 2 or Geometry as a junior, then the idea would be to take one of the early spring test dates. So for the SAT, that's typically going to mean March. For the ACT, it could mean April or February. And the idea is you have most of the math at that point, and it gives you a first attempt before that end of year rush. And then you could take it again, either in the spring or possibly early in the fall of senior year. The other big reason that September and October are highlighted here is because next year, when you're a senior, most of our students will apply to at least one college for an early action or early decision deadline. In a future webinar, we'll explain kind of what those deadlines mean and how they work, or you can ask in the Q&A if you're super curious now. And we're going to get to all the Q&A at the end, by the way, I should say that. But if you're applying for those early deadlines, then September is the last ACT that you can take as a senior, and October is the last SAT that you can take as a senior. Because they'll be the last ones where the scores get to the colleges in time for those early deadlines. If you're applying for regular deadlines, you actually have through December of senior year if you need it. Now, our goal for all of our students is to be done way before all of this stuff. I just like to give people kind of the full menu of options in case you need them. All right. The other big thing to talk about, of course, when it comes to standardized testing is the test optional movement. So pretty much every college went test optional during the pandemic because test centers couldn't open. So it's not a new thing. There have been colleges that have been test optional since the 80s, but it used to be kind of clustered in small liberal arts schools only, and now it's gone mainstream. So most colleges are still test optional. Some colleges have reverted back to requiring test scores. Some of the Florida state schools, University of Georgia, University of Tennessee, in general, the colleges that require test scores are clustered in the South. Then you also, on the other end of the spectrum, have the University of California and California state systems that are test blind. Test blind means you can't even send your test scores to them. They're not going to look at them. Test optional means you have the option to submit them or not. So essentially, in a test optional environment, the best way to apply is still with a strong score. One of the common phrases you'll see on schools' websites when it comes to test optional policies is something like, we will not penalize you for not including a test score on your application. The thing about that is that college admissions is at its core a competition. You have a large number of students competing for a small number of spots. And in a competition, for example, a basketball game, you don't lose a basketball game because the ref took your points away. You lose a basketball game because the other team scored more points than you. So when they say they don't penalize you for not having a test score, that doesn't mean they don't give other people more points for having that test score. So you can't think of test optional as a kind of excuse to ignore the SAT and ACT. If you do, you're going to get some bad news senior year when decisions come back in a lot of cases. When colleges release the data on their admissions rates for students with and without scores, we note something called a submitter advantage that goes from 20 to 140%. So what does that mean? I have here a list of unfortunately all of the colleges that have released data on their acceptance rates with and without tests. Most colleges won't show you this data because it's going to show something like this, as in it's going to show you that they're not as test optional as they want to sound like they are. In general, this testing advantage basically shows that, your admissions rate is this % stronger when you do submit a test score. So I will say the one caveat to all of this data is it is definitely true that the strongest students tend to submit test scores. That means it's a kind of lurking variable. Student A, whether they submit a test score or not, that's always an individual decision based on context. So for your student and whether they should send a test score or not in a specific situation to a specific school, that is a kind of detailed decision that I'll be happy to guide you through if you work with us. I work with our essay and application team and kind of help them make those test optional calls all the time for our students. I'm also happy to have that conversation with anyone who works with us on test prep, but not essays, just as a courtesy, because it's the kind of thing that I can kind of see through pretty quickly. And sometimes students and parents, they just don't have enough context for the big picture to make the decision themselves. In general, if you're at or above a college's average, always send the score. That's the easy part. The question is when you're like between the 50th and 25th percentile or just below that 25th percentile, at what point does it make sense to withhold it and not show it to the college versus at what point it makes sense to send it. But the clear thing from all of this information is essentially that when you have a strong test score, your admissions chances are best. And that was true before everyone was test optional, and that's true now too. So how can we help? With our test prep, we meet students where they are. So, we work with students all the time that come to us and they say, I have a near perfect score in every section of the ACT. I just need help with the math section. I'm working with the senior that fits this exact bill right now. At the same time, we have students who come to us and say, my student has a severe math learning disability, and this is going to be their biggest challenge on the test. Well, student A and student B there, we are not going to do the same thing with those two students. They have completely opposite needs. We don't have some kind of like pre-canned program that we march every student through, because a lot of students come to us and they don't need help with everything. So we have students complete practice tests as a way to identify their weaknesses. Sessions with our tutors are going to focus only on areas where students are missing questions. And that's because that's going to be the most efficient way for us to figure out what does this student need to learn to raise their score. So each week the student completes a practice test. They have that tailored session with the student or with the tutor that is going to highlight their areas of need and focus in on those. And parents are going to receive a weekly update from the tutor after each session, on what was covered. And, of course, we're here at the office to kind of discuss progress the whole way. So when you work with us, you can sort of think of me as your standardized testing strategist. Questions about what test date do I take, SAT or ACT? When it comes time, do I submit this score or do I withhold it? I'm here for all of those big picture conversations. And then meanwhile, your student has their tutor that works with them in the trenches on actually getting better with that test material. All right, with that, I'll hand it off to Kate.
Okay, great. So we're talking about the factors in your control, right? So we talked about grades and rigor. We talked about rec letters. We talked about test scores. Thank you, Jim, and testing in general. And fourth is extracurricular activities before we get to my favorite bit, which is the essays and applications. So, why are extracurricular activities important, right? So part of this thing, and I'm going to say this is probably especially true for you all going into junior year, right? You've come through several years of pandemic, right? It's been the pandemic. We've all been in there. It's been really brutal. You lost out on a lot of time, potentially. You lost out on some extracurriculars, potentially. So this has always been true that schools want you to be, they want to see how you engage in the world. What do you do with your free time? Who are you, right? That's one of the things they're going to look at. But they especially are going to be looking come this junior year, gosh willing, everybody is back in school full time and COVID is not so much of an issue, right? How are you using that time, especially making up for lost time, right? Are you meaningfully engaging in things that you care deeply about? You can list 10 activities on the Common App. There's 10 slots. You sort of will list them in order of what's most important to you or most prestigious. But don't forget that you also have an additional information section. So don't think, wait, I'm limited to just 10 slots. You can actually put more in. And if you work with us, part of what we'll do is talk about how to prioritize, how to describe them, that kind of thing. So this next piece of I know I need extracurriculars. What do I do about them? This is going to sound like a line, but it's not a line. You should do what you want to do. I cannot stress that enough, right? There are many paths to getting where you want to be for your own individual needs and goals, right? But the more you lean into and use junior year, especially to tune into what genuinely excites you, what sets you apart, what you want to nerd out about, what you fall down YouTube rabbit holes on, that's the stuff you want to look for ways to build out, right? So the big kind of most common example, it's the one from our co-founder, Eric Carlin's TED Talk about the rock band, is like a parent might look at a rock band, a student starting a band and think, wait a minute, that's not as good as club volleyball or doing debate club. And actually, from our perspective, we would argue that it is. If it's something the student wants to pursue and shows initiative, you could all of a sudden, if you start performing at senior centers or at your local park, then it ties into community service. If you make your own posters for it, then it ties into a graphic design interest. If you arrange songs or collaborate with your your bandmates. All of a sudden you're talking leadership skills and an interest in depth in music, right? So really following your heart and finding the things. One, what are the things that just bring me joy and bring balance to my life? I have a student right now who plays volleyball because she loves volleyball. There's no other reason. She just loves it, right? That's a great reason to stick with something you're doing. But that said, she's also pursuing painting because she's crazy about painting. She's done some classes outside of school. She's pursued it on her own. She's researched it on her own. And it all of a sudden makes her a little more dynamic, right? What admissions officers are, and this is the kind of crazy part, is people. They're just people, and they're going to admit people. So the more you lean into your own personal strengths, the more likely you are to come across as your own authentic self, right? So there are many things that are impressive and great, right? For instance, there are many college programs that are pre-set up. You can go, I know a really big one some of our students do is the Wharton program at Penn. They have a sports analysis course that's super cool. It is really cool. That is a great slot on your activity section. What would be doubly cool is if you're nuts about sports, if you then ran a fantasy football tournament with your friends and donated that money to Ukraine, or if you then took your interest in stats and applied it somewhere else, right? So part of when we say do what makes you happy, we really mean leaning with depth into the things that interest you, and especially looking for where there are paths that aren't already carved, right? How can you find a structure that's not pre-set up and find a new way to create your own path? One of these things, the note here says, if you discover a new interest late, that's okay. If you just find something and you're crazy about it junior, if you start studying, if you're taking an anatomy junior year and you go nuts over it, awesome. There's still time to do your own kind of independent research, to explain it, to contextualize it in your essays and the application in a whole. When we work with students, a big part of how we help them is thinking about how do we put that package together? How do we help you make sense of when you found your interest along with what you want to study, that kind of thing. So we can talk, we'll talk, that's a whole other webinar, right? But we'll talk more about that. Okay, great. How do I engage then? I know I love volleyball. I know I love, fantasy football. I love these different things. How do I make my own path? So as I said, biggest thing, doesn't have to be school sponsored. That's great. If you're pursuing student government or you're the captain of your lacrosse team and pursuing leadership in your clubs, all of that matters. We're just arguing for, okay, but what else? You have to imagine that everybody else in your Future Business Leaders of America club could write a pretty similar activity essay about what they did in that club. They're all in the same room. You guys worked on the same stuff. Cool. What else are you going to do? Well, maybe you want to reach out to a local business leader in your own community. Reach out to someone who started their own business, interview them, ask them questions, start an interview series and put it on a blog and then share it with your friends, right? There really are kind of, one of the weird benefits of the pandemic is I think people started to think and students started thinking much more about, well, what else can I do beyond the pre-structures that exist? And as far as I'm concerned, that's a huge great boon to your application, right? Any paths you can carve for yourself that are outside of the norm are great. So again, consistency is one thing I want to say, even though you can discover something late, consistency is something good, right? So it says, instead of joining 3 clubs, apply for leadership position one you're already in. That makes sense, right? You should and can explore, but you want to find a little balance between showing colleges, hey, I have some stick-to-itiveness. Like I kept volleyball because I love it, but junior year, I added this business interview section because I found I was crazy about marketing and I wanted to learn more about it, right? So really finding a balance of saying, hey, look, I can show up consistently, but I also went after the stuff that really mattered to me specifically. And don't forget, the internet is a glorious thing. You would be amazed at how many students who have found virtual internships or helping on research papers, all kinds of things, from cold call, well, I would say cold call back in the day of telephones. That's funny, but from just emails. Hey, dear Professor so-and-so, I'm fascinated by your work. Do you need any assistance? Really amazing things. Showing up with a piece of cake at a local business and saying, do you take interns? Would you, right? Especially those hands-on learning experiences are great. And if you work with us on essays, or if you do, we have these undergraduate advising sessions for students to sort of help plan them out, help plan out your kind of whole path through high school. If you're doing that, we'll talk to you and help you brainstorm with ideas of how to take what you already love and build off it. But really brainstorm, do a little concept map. What's something I love? What else can I do with it? How can I take that and do good with it? Raise money or help others, tutor kids, start a summer basketball camp for the kids in my neighborhood, right? How do you take what you love and do more? And especially the last note here is utilize your time in the summer. So at junior year, it's going to be tough academically, right? You're especially going to want to spend that summer catching your breath after how tough junior year was and writing your college essays. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But that said, summers are a great time to plan and really deepen those activities. Junior year summer, chef's kiss, sweet spot. That's what you should now be thinking. How can I do something this summer as I find a new passion or discover a new curiosity this year to really take it to the next level? And then I can bonus, be able to talk about it in my application. I really can't stress enough how little you should do things for your application, right? The truth is, better people make better applicants. Lean into the things that drive you and make you curious and help you improve the world around you, and the rest will fall into place. But admissions officers can see from 100 yards away if you're just doing something for an application, right? Yeah, I needed some service hours, whatever. So our philosophy is, it's stealing from a lovely phrase called Ikigai, right? And again, this is part of Eric Carlin's TED Talk, which it's in the email signature of our email. We'll send it along. You can check it out. It's 10 minutes, very charming. But we kind of love this because one, I love a Venn diagram. I just love a Venn diagram. But two, this spot really, what Ikigai is like finding that sweet spot between what you like to do, what you enjoy doing, what brings you joy, you do it naturally, what you're good at, and then what the world needs, right? So looking at an interest and saying, how can I take these things from my life that find that sweet spot? What are the things? Maybe I enjoy playing basketball, but I'm not very good at it. And the world doesn't need another lousy point guard, right? So fine, I'm going to keep playing basketball for me, but maybe I'm not so great at playing it, but maybe I'm a great coach. Maybe I'm great at analyzing basketball. So maybe you have kids who have been running around in your neighborhood and you're thinking, well, I could organize a little league or a little training camp over the summer, give them time, get some coaching experience, get them out of their parents' hair for a few days, that kind of thing. That would find that sweet spot, right? What you enjoy, what you're good at, what the world needs. And I will say, make sure it's, again, when I say don't do everything for your applications, we want you to be whole human beings. We want you to be happy and have joy and to rest and relax. We know that a big part of junior year is finding your rhythm and finding that balance between how do I stay sane and how do I get done all I want to do? How do I stay present for this amazing period of high school, especially post-COVID, while also thinking ahead to the fact that I want to apply to colleges. I've been working hard toward that goal, right? Junior year is all about that sort of seesaw. And so we respect that and love that, but really thinking practically for yourself, get a journal, have a calendar. What are you doing to track your progress just so that you can see the benefits of the time you're putting in? Remind yourself you're working towards something and make sure, especially with everything that's been going on with COVID and everything else, that you're building in time for your mental health. So again, we love having these brainstorming conversations about what can I do sort of outside of the box? How do I deepen my love? How do I find my Ikigai and what I'm interested in? That's a really fun conversation for us. So if you ever want to have a brainstorming session or set up an advising call, we'd love to do that. And we'd be happy to do that with you. So, okay, next piece. Okay, this is where I get to start talking about now what, right? So the next piece, the very last piece of the 5 factors is essays and applications, but we kind of can't get into that without backing up for a second and saying, okay, hold on. I know I've got to apply to college. What colleges am I applying to? When should I be thinking about that? How do I figure it out? So building your college list, I want to say to you, the good news is there are so many colleges to apply to. I am certain there are multiple schools that you could go out and make your way in, that you could find your fit, right? We're all about, our philosophy is the best college for you is the best fit school. It's what's your future home? Where can you see yourself thriving in academics, outside of academics? Does it have what you need, right? Will you be happy? That's the key thing. So starting saying, all right, I know I want to apply to college. How do I even put together a list that makes sense? It's so overwhelming. Picking those superficial factors of, you know what, I just want warm weather. I hate the winter. Or I've spent my whole life in a cornfield in Pennsylvania and I'm ready to try the West Coast, right? Finding those things like anything that has to do with distance, the weather, the size of the school, if they have, if you're obsessed with underwater basket weaving or cheese club, do they have a cheese club, right? Like finding those little things will help you narrow the field. It's not, it's not petty or small to think about those things. It's actually a great place to start, right? So how far do I want to go? What do I want the school experience to look like? And honestly, right now, pull on your networks, talk to your friends and cousins and family members and ask them about their college experiences. Get a sense of what's out there to help you start limiting your list. So as you're putting together a list, as I said, we're looking at match and fit. Where are you going to be most happy? So there's 4 levels of that. The social aspect, right? Is it a school that is a really big into Greek life school and you've always dreamed about that? And you can see how you're like, I want to live in a community and I want to do service and I'm excited about what this means. You've watched a lot of college movies. Fine, great. Or is that not your thing? Or you want a much smaller class size? Do you want a much more a different kind of environment on campus, a more liberal artsy campus, right? Physical, do you want a full-on enclosed campus feeling, or do you like feeling like, hey, I'm right in the middle of the city, the whole city's my backyard? Financial is, of course, going to be so personal, family to family, but it's something to think about now. I got to tell you, the worst time to think about finances and finding your fit is after you've gotten an acceptance to a school you can't afford. That is brutal. And I speak from experience on that, right? So thinking ahead of really getting your head around, okay, what schools meet my need? What do my financial aid package look like? What do I need? What's my parent situation? And having that conversation at home. I know it sucks. There's no way around it, right? All of us just want all of our students to be happy and have their dreams. And I'm with you on that. But there are some realities, including financials, right? So making sure that you start off saying, listen, here are your limitations. You know, Eric Carlin, the co-founder, his mom wouldn't let him get on a plane to go to college. So he had to be within driving distance. Maybe for you, it's finances. Maybe for you, it's academic because there's an incredibly complex interdisciplinary program that's only at a handful of schools. Or maybe you want to study marine biology. And even though you love Notre Dame, they don't have marine biology at Notre Dame, right? So how are you going to find that match and fit? Thinking those things now and kind of wrapping your head around it can make your life much easier and better when it comes to actually putting that list together and thinking about what your apps are going to be. So what I mean when I say like putting together a list or how do I find my match and fit, I call this, and this is because I'm like a NASA nerd, I call it like your mission statement. Like, what is your mission statement for college? Your individual mission statement, not go to the, you know, I can't tell you how many times students are like, I don't know, go to the most exclusive college I can get into. That makes no sense. That has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with your desires, what you need out of a great school, right? So when I say look within, I mean, what do you need from your college experience? And I'll throw myself under the bus here and say, I was a super liberal artsy, so everybody here's like, yeah, we're so surprised by that, but I was super liberal artsy, like English, theater, poet person, right? So when I was tutoring colleges, I knew that I wanted a school where like right after every play, my drama group, we'd go to this terrible diner and we'd sit at this diner all night long and like eat French fries and rehash what happened. And to me, that was the epitome of being out in the world, being in my community, what I wanted my life to look like, right? So I toured a bunch of colleges and financial fit was a big thing for me. So when I got to UMass and I thought, oh, you know, is this the right spot for me? Does it have the programs I need? I'm not sure what I want to study. And I found out they had an incredibly flexible program. When I tried the best dang grilled cheese I've ever had at the Route 9 diner, it had bacon on it. I got a milkshake. It was amazing. I could see myself there. You know, so when I say I want to attend a university where I can study a bunch of topics and be in the vibrant performing arts scene, that's me. And I found that at UMass, right? So really asking yourself, what do I want? And by the way, it's okay not to have an incredibly specific picture. You can be undecided and still say, even undecided, how do I limit those things? Another example, if you want to go on the sort of other side, would be like, I want to study engineering, but be outside. And I'm a hands-on learner. In that case, if a student came to me and said that, I'd say, what are your grades? What are your test scores? What about Cornell? They're in the middle of the woods. They've got gorges. They've got great hiking and skiing. They've got the Cornell Teams program that is really famous and all about hands-on learning. That might be the perfect fit for you, right? So having that sort of sense of self of, yes, what do I want to study, but what else? Like kind of what are the other 2 or 3 factors I need to be happy outside of class can make a huge difference. So starting now and thinking about what makes you happy is the way to put together your mission statement. So okay, let's say you've had the thinking, you've put your thinking cap on, you've decided what you want in a school, more or less. And by the way, you can cast a wide net. You don't have to apply to just one kind of school, as long as you have a reason for applying to each kind of school. Then you have to say to yourself, how do I realistically think about what my chances are school to school? How do I find balance in my list? So You've probably heard these terms before: reach, target, likely. People used to say safety schools. We don't really love that term because safety, one person's safety is another person's reach. Like, I don't think that's a very respectful term. Likely is more based on just the straight up numbers. How likely are you to get into that school? So looking at this graph, this will tell you, this is a percentile. This is something Jim touched on earlier. You know, we said if your test score is in the 50th percentile or higher, it's a no-brainer to send it. It's also a way to look at whether or not the school is a likely reach or target. So if you're in the 75th percentile or above for a test score, that's a likely school for you. If you're in that middle spot, it's a target school. And target, by the way, doesn't mean likely. It means target. It means some of those targets should say yes to you. Some of those targets may not, right? But there's kind of a balance between, and then a reach school is looking at that test score. And of course, that's nuanced if you're going test optional. And that's something we talk about with our essay students we're working with on essays all the time. But that's sort of a broad, and of course you're more than your test score, but it's just a broad, quick, I'm going to look on niche.com, or I'm going to look on my Naviance with my school and see, hey, wait a minute, where does this school fall on my list? Looking at test scores is a very fast way to kind of get that example. So for what do we mean by this? So University of Wisconsin, I will say, interestingly, this data is now 2 years old and Wisconsin is hot. I like to think that I was behind Wisconsin before other people were behind Wisconsin. I think it's a great school. Everybody's all about the Wolverines. I am more pro Badger personally. Sorry, Michigan people. I just like it as a school. I think it's got a lot of great stuff going for it. So if you are, so University of Wisconsin, the 25th to 75th percentile 2 years ago, and again, this is going to be much higher now because of test optional and the things that have happened in the last few years, but 2 years ago was 1,300 to 1,440 on the SAT, right? So their average GPA is 3.87, and they've got a 57% acceptance rate. That's going to be much lower, I would imagine, when the new data comes out. So for student A, who has a 1,540, that's a likely school. For student B, who's got a 3.9 GPA and a 1,350, that's a target. Nowadays with the data, I'd probably actually put student B as a reach as well. And then student C, a 1,200 SAT and a 3.5, that's a reach. So again, it's art and science, it's both, but using these numbers just as a way to get kind of a baseline sense, and then having conversations with us about, you know, fit and that kind of thing can help you make more informed choices about that. Of all the schools you're going to apply to, here's a sentence no one likes to hear: your likely schools are the most important. And the reason for that is this: sometimes you end up going to your likely school for reasons you don't expect. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's something in your family, sometimes they just end up giving you the best fit. But at the end of the day, you need to sleep at night knowing you have a school that you actually want to go to on your list that you're going to get into. I can't tell you the number of students who add likelies. They go, oh, I'm going to add Rutgers, or I'm going to add X, Y, and Z school, Franklin and Marshall, as my likely. And I'll say, why? And they'll say, because I can get in. And I'm like, yeah, but why? You could get into a bunch of schools. Why is that your likely? Trying to put, I actually think you can kind of tie together, putting together that mission statement with your likely school. What is the school you're most likely to get into that has the most fits for you in terms of what your life is going to look like? If you start building your list there, you're going to be okay no matter what, right? And that's not to say don't be ambitious, but it's to say be realistic and just sleep better, right? So looking for, is my test score in the 75th percentile or above? Is my GPA and class rank where it needs to be? And making sure you have, we say 2 to 3 insurance policy schools. Honestly, personally, I'm happy with 2. If you've got 2 and you did the work and you genuinely like it, and sure, you're going to throw in Rutgers because whatever, you're going to do it anyway, fine. But 2 schools that you know you really, really could see yourself at. And then it just sort of takes the pressure off the rest of the list. It's great to shoot high, but it's good to know you feel good about the back, you know, your kind of backup option. So as I said, how do I know if it's reach, likely, or target? Using that score is a great way to do it. It's a science and an art. Don't forget Naviance at your school. So if you haven't experienced, if you haven't done the Naviance thing with your school counselor, now's a great time to ask. Naviance, if you haven't looked at it yet, is the thing that's going to tell you how do people at your particular school who share your school profile do at the colleges they apply to, right? So it'll tell you, oh, we got this many kids with this, their GPA and their test score were here, got into BU last year. That can give you some information about what to expect for yourself. You can also Google something called the Common Data Set. So you could do Princeton University Common Data Set, and that will tell you all the info about the test scores, the GPAs, that kind of thing, to get you a sense of where the school fits on your list.
And let me
Grades.
add
Oh,
with
go ahead.
Naviance, I mean, going back to your point, Kate, about Wisconsin,
Right.
the data in Naviance is old. I mean, it'll have data from last year. It will also have data from like 10 years ago. So be careful about just assuming trend lines on Naviance are kind of the end all be all.
Right.
Because a lot of that data is from a long time ago. It could include like student athletes and things like that. So Naviance is always something you want to take with a grain of salt. It can be useful, but just keep in mind kind of the ifs, ands, and buts that go with it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. Totally. And I think, there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts throughout this, right? So for example, when we say consideration of test optional and consider the acceptance rate, you might have a 1600 SAT and straight A's and all APs through all of your high school career. That's awesome. You should be really proud of yourself. You worked really hard. That is absolutely going to help you in college admissions. Of course it is, right? But that puts you at what we'd call, like we have an admissions officer colleague, it puts you what we'd call standard strong, right? At a school that has 15% or lower, or even 20% or lower admissions rate, having a 1600 SAT and straight A's doesn't really mean anything. You have to figure that everybody else applying to that school, or at least a large portion of them, are going to have the same test scores and grades as you. So then the question becomes, how do you stand out above the pack? Answer: great activities and great essays and applications. Again, more on that later. But right, how do you stand out from the pack? And the thing I keep telling everybody, the stat that I can't get out of my head, is that last year we taught Penn accepted 2,500 students, right? That was their class. But the 2,500 students behind them, the ones they didn't accept, had the same average GPA. So that means those 2,500 you did get in had something beyond that standard strong, right? So just be careful of assuming. I'll put Michigan out there. Michigan is as competitive as the most competitive schools now, right? Michigan's great, amazing school, but its percentage rate every year going down and down and down. So even though you might say, hey, listen, it looks like I fit as an academic profile, it looks like it would be a target for me, Michigan is nobody's target. Any of the Ivies, nobody's target. They're all reaches. Look at that percent number. Remember, if it's a wider pool, they're going to take fewer students, right? So what's that percent number? And when I say be honest, not hopeful, I mean, I'm just kind of combining those factors, right? Jim talked about the fact of grade inflation. We talked about standard strong. Be honest with yourself. If you focus on a couple good likelies, if you start there before you go ahead and fall in love with the Yale campus, then you're gonna be more likely to set yourself up for success. So this question we get a lot is, how many schools should I apply to? So a lot of people talk about the balanced list, have three likelies, 3 targets, and 3 reaches, right? Fine. That's a good way to think about it. You wouldn't necessarily go wrong doing that. My feeling is you have to have those 2 or 3 likelies. Beyond that, with the students I work with, I don't care if you shoot for the moon. If you genuinely like your likelies, I don't care if your list is, quote, imbalanced and there's more reaches on there. If you can say to yourself, I would be happy at Pitt, but I also really am excited about Carnegie Mellon, then fine. If a lot of your schools on the rest of your list are more like Carnegie Mellon, you're going to hear no more often than you're going to hear yes, because they're reach schools, but all you need is 1 yes, right? So my thing is less balance and more adding thoughtful schools. All the Ivies are not the same. Any kid who wants to apply to all the Ivies, that's an immediate red flag for me for working with them. I think you haven't thought about your mission at all. You don't care. You just want a name brand. You don't care what the school has to offer you. And admissions officers will see through that in an application because the research won't be there. A Brown education is so different from a Yale or a Cornell education. Your experience and campus, what you can do in the courses, everything else, so different, right? So really focusing on what you need and using that to put together your school list rather than worrying about a perfect 3, 3, and 3. And I will say this last piece is thinking about how much work there is to apply, right? So I often tell students, like the most common reach school I tell students to add if it's a fit is Northeastern. I'm like, you know what? What the heck? Apply to Northeastern. It has no essays. It's no extra work. Like, yes, you have to put yourself out there emotionally to potentially get denied, but you don't have to spend hours upon hours crafting an essay for it, right? Versus if you say to me, I want to apply to Stanford, I'll say to you, great, they have an 8% acceptance rate and about 1 billion essays you're going to have to write. It's a ton of work, and you could be spending that time on schools that are a better fit for you and that you're more likely to get into, right? So I will say that's another argument for getting started in the process early, is if you know you're going to have a lot of supplements, and a lot of these high, kind of more competitive schools tend to have supplements, although there's no rhyme or reason, right? Northeastern, great school, no essays. But generally, just thinking early about your list and making a plan for how much work you're going to have to do is a really, really good idea. And I will just say the last part about being realistic and honest, go ahead and cast a wide net. I would rather my students deal with rejection. I always say, like, we're strong, we can handle rejection. I don't want you to deal with regret, right? So if you're going to tell me I ended up going to the University of Delaware, but I'm always going to wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten into Oberlin. That's the worst case scenario for me. I would much rather you apply to Oberlin, put the work in and get denied and know, guess what? That's not my path, right? So really finding that balance between ambition and your sanity. And as an essay coach, that's a big thing we sort of talk students through. So, okay, when do you work on these essays? You don't have to work on them now, my friends. We're not crazy people. It's August 25th of your junior year. You don't have to write your essay now. You do have to be thinking about how to be a great whole person, how to keep your grades up, and how to make a plan for writing your personal statement, your college essay, right? The more, just realistically, the more meaningful stuff you do, the more meaningful stuff you're going to have to talk about when it comes to college essays. So that's part one. But we know junior year is crazy. We think like one of the biggest things to think about is, ideally, we always tell students, hey, guess what? We want to really take advantage of that summer after junior year. But the truth is we're meeting with students who are juniors as soon as November this year, right? We want to have our consults now because we can get to know you, know going in, hey, have a conversation. Are you going to take the test again? What's your kind of test plan? What schools you're thinking about? We love having consults now and signing up with students now because we can have the most impact, help them brainstorm summer activities before the summer even gets here, right? So that's part of the reason I would make an argument for starting early, even if you're not writing the actual essay until you get to the winter or spring. It's still worth kind of putting in your brain, all right, I know this is going to have to happen. How do I get other ideas? I always say to my students, like, why did I work so hard for the past 4 years? When it comes to college essays, nobody wants to write them. I don't really understand that because I love, I mean, this is my nerd word. I'm like, what do you mean you don't want to write? Have you seen UChicago's essays? They're so fun, right? For me, I'm a big nerd. It's a good time. For most students, writing essays is not a good time. And I understand that. But you did work so hard all the way through high school to get into a college that is going to be a great fit for you and make you happy. It's worth your time and effort. We always say, like, listen, your calculus teacher will see your calculus homework tomorrow. That matters, right? In 4 years, it's not going to matter. In 4 years, it is going to matter whether or not you spent time in your college essay, right? That's key to your next step. So it's a hard thing to hold in mind. I know we're saying, think about your test scores, think about your activities, think about your grades, but really the essays are the only chance on your application for you to do you, for you to show something beyond the numbers and the stats and the activities. It's for you to be heart and soul. So building up activities and experiences and curiosities now during junior year and going in thinking, oh, I know I'm going to have essays to write and I should be thinking about what kind of colleges I want to go to and talking to people is super important. So the dream is, the ideal is, and I would say many of our students are in this boat now that we've been working with, we want to have most of your essay work and application work done by the time senior year starts. So if you start in November, you have a consult with us, then we start in the spring, brainstorming ideas, getting to know each other, trickling things through. Then you spend the summer working really hard, knocking out that personal statement, every part of the application, and then those supplements. The dream is by November 1st, you're like, free. Everything's ready and done. Maybe I've got to make a few adjustments, but now I can focus on keeping my senior grades up and living your best senior year life. So it is a little bit of hold yourself in the now, but keep the present and the future in mind. So that said, we've been talking about essays. My favorite thing, what kind of essays do you need to write? So the big one is the personal statement. People call that the Common App essay, means the same thing. Personal statement, Common App essay, same deal. 650 words. That's, as I said, the heart and soul. It's your chance to show admissions officers who you'd be on campus. There's a very common essay that a lot of schools have. We call it the Why College essay, which is like, why do you want to apply to Boston University? Why do you want to apply to Tulane? Why is Cornell the best fit for you? Or the why major essay, why engineering, why biology, why undecided. And by the way, you can apply undecided without hurting your application. More on that in another webinar. I'm actually a big fan of undecided. Don't think, if you're out there thinking, I don't know what I want to study, I'm doomed. That's not the case. There's a way to apply undecided that will show you as a strong dynamic student, but another day. And then, so most common are the personal statement, the why college or why your major, and then a community you belong to is a very common one, right? Something of, hey, what's the community you come from? And it can be as broad as, I'm a person who is obsessed with dim sum and I'm really into dumplings. Or it can be as specific as I'm a Jewish student. My attendance at the synagogue is really important to me. I do X, Y, and Z in my community, right? So that can be really fun to brainstorm with students. And a last common one is an activity. What's a very meaningful activity to you? So the personal statement, 650 words. It's shorter than you think. It's only a page and a little bit more than a page. It's actually a brutally short length. On the Coalition app, you get actually fewer words than that. You get only 500 to 550. I'm a big fan of the Common App. We can talk if you have questions about what the Coalition app is. That's fine. We can talk about it. Most schools will take it. But my feeling is, why wouldn't you just apply on the Common App, since almost all the schools, except like MIT and the UCs, take it, right? So that's the big piece here. 650 words to say your piece. What's it going to be? So when it comes to how you put together your personal statement, and this is kind of my 2-second pitch for whether you work with us or not, I'm going to tell you this, right? You can get ideas from 2 spots, your resume. So what's cool stuff you've done, the activities you've done, your jobs or internships, if you've done any service-based learning, the skills you learned. I have a student writing a super cool essay right now that's all about his little hands-on projects that he does, everything from baking to sewing to metalwork, really, really cool. Or it can come from your eulogy. And don't worry, you're not dying, you're not dead. When we say eulogy, we mean, what are the things people are going to say about you? No one's going to get up at your funeral and say, Jim was a straight A student. They're going to say, Jim never stopped giving me a hard time about who I drafted in fantasy football or whatever, right? Like, what are the things that are really you? What are the things that matter to you, that people who know you understand are a key component of who you are? Traditions that you care about, the time you met Bill Murray in an elevator, how you're obsessed with fruit. That's like a really fun essay I worked on a couple of years ago, a fruit essay. It was marvelous, right? Your passions, those things that don't show up on an academic record, that can often be a great inspiration for what your personal statement could be. Want to take me to the next one? Thank you so much. So, okay, that said, what makes a bad essay? This is the easiest answer. Something that's not personal. Something that you think the admissions officers want to hear. The minute you start to think, what do admissions officers want to hear about me? You're going in the wrong direction. Start from within. What is essential to you? No matter who's hearing it, what is essential to you that someone who knows you would need to know about you, right? So the best essays are not the best written. They really aren't. Sometimes being quote unquote a great writer can actually get in your way in an essay. What you really want to push for and think about is personal insight, personal reflection. Who are you? What are you thinking about? How have you changed and grown? What impact do you make in community? Who are you around? Who do you surround yourself with, right? Cliche topics. I'm going to say this with love. You can't write the dead grandma essay, right? The problem with that is not that your relationship with your grandma wasn't deeply meaningful. It's that an essay about your grandma is an essay about your grandma, even if it's beautifully written. It's not going to be about you, right? So those cliche topics fall into writing about something like that. If you're an athlete, unfortunately, an incredibly common topic is, hey, I got injured and then I got better and here's what happened. Doesn't matter what sport it's in, it tends to be a similar thing. That's what that's what we mean by cliche topics. Controversial topics, this one's kind of easy. You want to stay away from anything that is going to kind of shut an admissions officer out just by reading it, right? Now, obviously, there depends on your school list and you can think about fit. There are certain schools that have religious prompts, if that's part of you. That's awesome. You're looking for a school where that's part of your mission statement. Of course, that should be reflected in your essays, but just thinking broadly. And then the last kind is diary entry. And I will say students are not often asked to do this kind of writing. You shouldn't know how to write this essay. You've never done it before. It's not a 5-paragraph essay. It's not an argument essay. It's somewhere between a personal narrative and, I don't know, something memoir, right? Somewhere between those two things. And the truth is that oftentimes when you open up that gate to say to students, tell me what you need to know about me, what often comes out at first is the kind of highest emotion stuff. And that might be, we have an example here of like sibling rivalries, right? There's certain things that you need to work out and write about for you, and it can be very meaningful to you, but it's not necessarily the you want to present to an admissions officer. So just making sure you're asking about yourself, is this something that really truly only could have happened to me and is not cliche? am I just venting here, or am I talking about something meaningful? And am I thinking about how an admissions officer would view me? In other words, if you wouldn't walk up to someone and shake their hand and say, hey, I'm the this kid, then you don't want to write about that as your topic, right? So that's a kind of good way to think about it. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. So yes, there are good and bad topics, yes and no. Sports, bad topic. Dance, bad topic. Horses, bad topic. Dead grandma, bad topic. That said, we've actually worked on great versions of all those essays. There's just extra pressure in essays about that to rise to the kind of top 10% of that pile, right? So we use the example of, we had a great student who loved football, but was terrible at football, and actually discovered his way into coaching and stats and being a part of the game on the sidelines. That made a really interesting football essay up against all the other students who are writing about football or any sport. All of a sudden he's coming at it with a different angle, right? So that can work. It exists. So it's all about how you say it. There are good essays about everything, but I always tell kids, like, you could have climbed Mount Everest and cured cancer and still write a terrible essay. It's really true. If you go at it with the wrong angle, where it's not about your personal insight, your growth, who you are as a person, it's the wrong essay. Don't focus on the prompts. If I'm honest with you, don't even look at the prompts. It's the first thing your AP English teachers are going to want to make you do when AP tests are over. Don't look. Call us first. Call us in November. Have a plan. The minute you start looking at the Common App prompts, you're automatically putting yourself in a box. And the best thing you can do for yourself is start from within. What's meaningful to me? How could I turn that into a topic? That could be a theme. That could something I'd talk about, rather than what's a challenge I've overcome, which is the same place everybody's starting from thinking who's looked at that prompt. Does that make sense? All right, next one, Jim. How do we work with students? This is my favorite bit. So as I said, we are actually taking signups for the class of next year. Starting in November, we'll do consults. We help students from now, from, hey, you're going into junior year. What are you going to do this summer? What classes are you taking? How's it going over there, right? What are you building into? What are you excited about? What curiosity do you have? What would be a good fit for you? We start talking about those things as soon as basically January rolls around with students, when we start meeting with students. So the dream would be helping you all the way from the kind of concept of what's your college mission statement, what could you be, all the way through you putting your deposit down on your dream school, right? So even if we get all your essays done by November 1st, which we will, you can then call us later and say, hey, Michigan deferred me. Michigan defers everyone, right? And we'll go, oh my God, I can't believe they dared to. They're jerks, but here's what you're going to do. You're going to write a follow-up letter of interest in this way, right? So we really do, as essay coaches, support students from kind of zero to the finish, right? So we work on unlimited drafts. That means we work on essays until we love it, until you love it, and until we think the school will love it. And we do meetings. It's not like tutoring where we meet for a set time. It's more flexible. So, there'll be a lot of back and forth on email. You can request meetings. There's sort of built-in Zoom chats throughout the process. And we really just want you to feel like anytime you get stuck or confused, you can reach out to us and we can hop on and find a way to help you make progress. This is the most fun thing for me. I feel like no matter what you do, it's great to take stock before college and say, what's special about me? What's interesting about me? What do I have to contribute? What do I want in my life? Like, I love this process because I think it's super cool before going into college to realize your strengths and reckon with your dreams and make a plan for it, right? So having those conversations is really fun for me. The only thing we don't help you with, unfortunately, is we won't write the essays for you. So it's got to be your essay. Hate to say it. I know we just say essay coaches, but we're not writing it for you, right? So that's one piece we're not going to do. It's going to be your authentic self, for good or bad, and we're going to support you every step of the way. So, we'll also, Jim, we'll include a sign up link for any juniors who are interested in maybe signing up for a consult. No pressure. We will be here. And when we email the slides out, we'll put the link in to sign up for that as well. So that's me talking a while. Thank you so much for listening. Jim, is there anything else I forgot? Did I miss anything?
No, I think you killed it, Kate. Great job. So now we'll move into the Q&A. We've got a couple questions here already, but please type them into the Q&A or the Zoom chat, and we're happy to answer them. Kate or I will take them kind of depending on whose area they overlap the most with.
Totally.
First question we have here is, how important is sustaining a language to AP level for most selective schools on a science track? So a student interested in a more sciencey realm, if it's the most selective schools in the country, then it's important to have 4 years of a foreign language. if you're applying to the most selective schools in the country, it's important to take the most challenging schools or most challenging courses that your school offers. So, course selection is always a tricky topic because, you want to challenge yourself, but also still do well. And because you're trying to hit that kind of subjective middle of challenge yourself, but still do well, there is no kind of canned answer to should a student do X, right? It all depends on the particular circumstances. In general, if your goal is the most selective schools in the country, though, then you need to take the most challenging classes and get an A in them. Again, that's not going to be the goal for most students, nor should it be. But if that is your goal, then you should take that language to the AP level. It's going to make a difference if you don't. Another question, is your SAT test prep in person? So we do offer in-home tutoring in some areas of the greater Philadelphia area. So please let me know where you are and I can answer that more specifically.
Right. And I also want to say we were virtual before it was cool. So just in case you're thinking we went virtual because of the pandemic, we were virtual. We have that process completely smoothed out. It's not like we had to slap that together. That has been from the business model from the jump. So in case that's interesting to you, we absolutely have been virtual all the way along.
Yeah, we started doing virtual test prep in 2013. And I've actually been personally tutoring exclusively virtually since 2018.
Right.
So that just goes to show you kind of how used to this we are. All right, another great question. In your experience, do you find that athletes who may be getting recruited for sports in college need to have a test score to show earlier than later in the process? The answer is definitely yes. And this is doubly true if your student is trying to get recruited at academically competitive schools. The test score is part of the process. So some schools will require test scores from their athletes. Some won't in this kind of test optional world that we're in. But because some schools do, and some academically competitive schools do, test scores are part of the recruiting process. Typically, coaches are given sort of an average that their team has to hit by the admissions office. And so if your student is bringing that average up, then that means the coach doesn't need to like them as much as an athlete because, oh, well, you're helping me on the test score front so that this incredible athlete at this other school has a lower score. I can now go after them because you're bringing the average up, right? So it will matter in terms of where you can be recruited and how many schools you'll be recruited by if you have that really strong test score. So definitely you'd want to have it earlier in the process as a student athlete than most students.
Right.
How important is course load difficulty for senior year? Just as important as every other year. It is important.
I wish we could tell you could slack off. I wish that for you also, but it's just not the way it goes.
Yeah, and the grades will be sent at whatever point your transcript is sent. So at whatever point your grades are, when your transcript gets sent to that school, they'll see those beginning of senior year grades in addition to the course load. And academic rigor is a big distinguishing factor when you're looking at the transcripts of these students applying to hyper-competitive schools. So it absolutely does matter.
Right. Yeah, and I will say the last piece, I'm just one piece that's holistic is, again, balance, right? Like I feel like this whole presentation has been a little bit twisted toward really, really high academic schools. And that's great. Those are a great fit for many students. But I also want to say, we're living in a time of mental health crisis. You've been living through a pandemic, right? Like you being a good person and living a good life and being happy also matters. There's a school out there that will be a fit for you. So I just want to put it out there. Be ambitious, of course, but also find your balance that works for you where you can be happy and still be thinking forward. And that can't be undersold enough.
That's a great point. All right, final question, unless more come in while I'm speaking here. So how can you determine the difference between a college recruiting for academics, as in specifically going after a student for academics, versus ordinary marketing to drive up their application numbers? The answer to that is I've never heard of the former.
Right, it's all marketing.
Harvard doesn't need you. I mean, that's the sad truth. They're going to get the next incredible high school student from somewhere else in the country. So colleges, students fill in certain information when they take a test like the PSAT. And then College Board turns, and part of that will be like a self-reported, here's my high school GPA. College Board will turn around and be like, hey, Harvard, you want our list of students who have between, a 3.5 and 4.0 GPA, so you could send them mail. And then Harvard will say, yeah, here's our money. Can we get those addresses? Then Harvard will send you mail. or email or whatever the case may be. It's never targeting students specifically for academic reasons. They're buying information in buckets. They're saying, we want the addresses of every student who scored above X on the PSAT and self-reported a GPA above Y. And then they send all those students information. It's not targeting students specifically. Students get recruited for athletics and for music, and I believe that's about it. Another question, what if you don't exactly like the bigger schools, but you also want the job opportunities that come with bigger schools?
Ooh, can I take that one a little bit, Jim? So great question. And I want to say to you, do your research. The answer is just do your research. There are so many, like I think about in my own backyard, right? I live on 43rd in Baltimore. Drexel is right near me, right? Drexel has a co-op program that's going to allow you chances to build connections, to network, to get experience in the jobs that you might want to try after you graduate. And it's not Michigan University, it's not that giant school, right? So I do understand that balance, but I think the truth is, like, I would start searching and you would laugh at how much content there is out there. You might think it's silly to Google small schools that have the best networking opportunities, or small schools with the most hands-on learning, right? Actually, I guarantee you there's a ton of content out there about it. So really just starting to think about, okay, I know about myself. That's a great, by the way, whoever asked that, you're on your way to your mission. I'm into that. I don't want a giant school. I want a school where I can build relationships. So then Google schools that value relationships, or schools that value, housing situations where you're living with other people who are studying what you're studying, right? They absolutely exist. You just need to do the research. And I will say we do offer a college list service that's sort of a survey you can fill out that could help with sort of things like that. But having that conversation with students about what's your mission, what are the schools that fit it, is something we love to do as essay coaches and also in advisory meetings.
And I'll add to that the question kind of conflates the idea of being a large school with having a strong network.
Right.
That's not, large
Truth
schools
and state, right?
have strong networks.
Right.
There are a lot of small schools with super strong networks.
Colgate.
You can find them. And so I would advise you to kind of do some research on smaller schools that have those great networks, so that
how do schools support alumni? Google that too, right? Yeah,
exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for attending. This has been a blast for me and Kate. We love nerding out about all this stuff with you. So like I said, I'll send an email tomorrow. It'll include the slides as well as the link to sign up for an essay consultation or sign up for tutoring if you'd like to do either. No pressure, but the links will be there. If you have any questions that are more specific to your individual student, please call the office or send us an email and we're happy to talk it through. All right, thank you all and have a good one.
Bye, Jim. Thanks, y'all.
Bye-bye.